Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Kainamui wash processed Kenya from Fieldwork Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Fieldwork, based out of Abbotsford, Australia. And this is their first ever appearance on this channel, and the first ever appearance for any Australian coffee roaster, as we've had a number of people request that we review more Australian coffee roasters. And historically speaking, it's actually been very difficult to get Australian coffee roasters in the United States. In fact, this coffee was picked up at Revolver when we were up in Vancouver. However, I have seen more multi-roasters start carrying more Australian coffee roasters, so I am hoping to review more of them here in the near future. However, for the time being, I am looking forward to discussing our first ever Australian coffee roaster, as this right here is day 41. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a 16.67 to 1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 201 degree Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this one definitely came out a fair bit more developed than I think I was expecting. I feel like a lot of people would most closely align this with a medium, but maybe on the slightly lighter side of that medium profile, as it definitely had a fair bit of development to it. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 20, first impression, and the cup was quite bright and candied right from the onset, as it did skew a fair bit in this somewhat complex stone fruit direction, as that was a lot more of the brightness I was experiencing than what I might have anticipated to be more of the tart berry sort of brightness that's typically associated with Kenyan coffees. Definitely a fair bit of citric aspects to this cup as well, so for the most part it left a positive first impression, even though I did note a slight bit of smokiness present within the cup. Day 22, ran it through the Chemex, and this brew method definitely seemed to accentuate a lot of the savory Kenyan-like characteristics to the coffee. So for that reason, I didn't necessarily enjoy this brew method as much as I enjoyed the V60, as it did come out slightly complex, especially in the cool down, as I could yet again feel a little bit of those listed stone fruit aspects to the cup. But at this time, it was definitely dominated by a lot more of the savory components to it. Day 24, back through the V60, and this is when I really started to lean into a lot of the smoky aspects to this cup, as there was definitely a fair bit more development to it than I might have expected. It does have a lot of classic Kenyan brightness, but it does continue to also lean a little bit more in this slightly stone fruit citric brightness as opposed to the tart berry brightness. At this time, I began wondering if maybe it was a little bit more of the priming effect, because I could see it either way. I think I was just convincing myself more that it was a little bit on the stone fruit side of things, given that's the notes that they had listed on here. Day 27, back through the Chemex, and the cup is coming out a little bit more smoky this time as well, especially through the Chemex. That seemed to accentuate two qualities, the smokiness and the savoriness, two things that I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of, especially when it comes to Kenyan coffees, as in addition to that, there were more of these bright and tart side of things. So this is when I kind of said to myself, am I really tasting a lot of these complex stone fruit aspects, or is this really just a little bit more of a vintage Kenyan-like cup of coffee in general? This time definitely felt a lot more Kenyan-like, as there were subtle stone fruit aspects. They're somewhat noticeable in the cool down, but for me at this time, I'm starting to think that I'm getting a lot more of the vintage Kenyan-like characteristics to it. Day 30, ran it through the April dripper, and it's the best it's been since the initial start. The first couple of days I had of this coffee left a positive first impression. However, given the smokiness and the savoriness I was experiencing, this April dripper seemed to kind of tone those aspects down, while a little bit more emphasis was focused on the brown candy aspects to it. They do have a caramel note listed on here. Truth be told, I had a little bit of difficulty pulling that out, in addition to the peach that they have listed on here. There were slight Kenyan-like brightness components within this cup as well, and it did feel a little bit more back in line with that listed stone fruit. So for that reasons, this was maybe one of my favorite days of this coffee. I feel like maybe I should have persisted a little bit more with the April dripper, but I was still waiting on some filters for this coffee. Day 32, and this is the first time I put any sort of asterisk next to it because I was really sick when I was reviewing this coffee on this day. So back through the Chemex, and the cup is the most smoky it had been to this point, as there was a lot of brightness to kind of contrast that too. It's getting a lot of acidity while at the same time getting a lot of smokiness, which are two things I don't necessarily love in coffee. Slight caramelized aspect, at this time it was maybe the most pronounced it had been up to this point. And it's skewing pretty strong in that smoky savory direction, so not necessarily enjoying the direction that this coffee is going. Day 35, lowered the temperatures, and I got slightly better results. That's why I settled on lower temperatures and a slightly more diluted recipe, as it did tone down some of those smoky aspects. In addition to that, it seems to heighten a little bit more of that brown candy aspect to the cup. Not quite as savory as it had been on previous days, less bright, with slightly more of that, I'm going to still say, complex stone fruit-like aspect. Day 38, the cup feels like it might have peaked at an earlier day, and I'm starting to wonder if maybe the window was a lot earlier in this coffee, that if maybe I would have started around day 10 and finished it around day 22, which is when I still got a nice day of this coffee. That's where the window for it might have been, as at this time it's skewing so much in the traditional medium profiled Kenyan direction, as it has a lot of these smoky savory aspects to it, with a lot more of these tart berry aspects to it. It does get better as it cools down, but it is still quite smoky regardless of any sort of adjustments I had made. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And this is a very interesting tasting wheel for a number of reasons, but we have quite a few level 4s, and I think this is the only tasting wheel I've ever made in my entire life that has all level 4s or level 3s, because everything on this tasting wheel falls into one of those two categories. So I guess we'll discuss the level 4s, and we will start with the finished level 4. I don't even know if there's too much to say on that, because that's very Kenyan-like. I've always said that if a Kenyan coffee scores underneath a 4 for the finish, then something's wrong. But yeah, this one definitely had a fair bit of a finish to it, most distinctly in the savory and smoky side of things. So definitely justified there at that mark. And interestingly, something I've been highlighting right from the onset is that it had a lot of brightness to the cup as well, which is why the acidity scores at that level 4 mark. Again, very classic for Kenyan coffees. It would be really surprising if even a very developed Kenyan coffee didn't at least score that level 4, because they tend to have so much brightness to them. So those two things, very much in line with expectations. Berry fruit, level 4. By the end, I just said to myself, okay, this tastes a lot more like a vintage Kenyan berry than it really does any of the stone fruit aspects. So I really need to put this at the level 4. That being said, the citrus and the stone fruit, I feel like I could pull out enough of both of those things to justify level 3 marks for both of them, especially the citric aspects. And the stone fruit thing is a little complex. It's a little difficult to pull out, and it's a lot more distinct and noticeable as the cup is cooled down nearly to room temperature. So for that reason, I can still see it, but I feel like maybe earlier days it might have been a little bit more pronounced in the coffee. Smokiness level 4, yes, I think I kind of mentioned right from the onset that there were times I kept feeling this coffee had so much smokiness present within it, and I often don't mind more developed Kenyan coffees because I feel like they make for much more well-rounded coffees in general. It's typically the super light Kenyan coffees that come out super tomato-like, but I think the issue I had with this is it still scored level 4 in the smokiness, but at the same time it still scored level 4 in the savoriness, as well as there was a fair bit of the savory Kenyan-like aspects within this coffee. In addition to that, the body scores level 4, so it definitely had a fair bit of texture to it, a much more heavy-bodied cup of coffee in general. And then we have a couple of level 3s, and I think they're the important level 3s worth noting. So we'll actually touch on the bitterness real quick, because that was a little bit of that coffee bitterness, which can come from some, more development in a cup of coffee. The cleanliness level 3, that's not necessarily too bad. That's typically where I score most Kenyan coffees, especially when they have a lot of savory aspects. Usually it's the Kenyan coffees that I score that level 4 mark that I am very impressed with. So this one right here, a combination between the savoriness, the smokiness, as well as not necessarily having the most defined flavor profile to it, definitely justified that level 3. There's nowhere else I could really put that. And then the sweetness level 3, it wasn't necessarily the sweetest Kenyan coffee I had. I think going into it, it sounded like a Kenyan coffee that might have had some great sweet components to it. But for me, I think that's the max I was ever able to pull out from this coffee. In hindsight, looking back on this, I wonder how this coffee might have turned out if I ran it through the automatic coffee maker. Something maybe I should have done at some point, but yeah. For what I was able to do with this coffee, I feel like this is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I've said before that I don't mind slightly more developed Kenyan coffees in general, but I think this one pushed it just slightly a little too far for me. In addition to that, it had, my least favorite Kenyan characteristics, most distinctly focusing on that savory aspect. And while I went into this one with really high expectations, given I have really high expectations for Australian coffees and coffees that sound like this. I mean, we're looking at the notes. If I recall correctly, there's peach, there's caramel, and I think that there's some sort of citric note, like a grapefruit sort of thing. And that very much sounds like my type of Kenyan coffee. And for whatever reason, I always struggle to pull out peach from Kenyan coffees, and this one was no exception to it, as I think it was a lot of the priming effect. I think I was convincing myself more that it was there than it actually was. And if anything, by the end I settled on, okay, this coffee just tastes a lot more like a traditional classic Kenyan for me, which isn't my type of Kenyan coffee. So for that reason, not necessarily my favorite. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, though, is makes very, very simple Kenyan recommendation. If you do like a little bit more on the development scale, if you do like a lot of those savory aspects, a lot of the brightness, this still has those, has a lot of body to it as well, which is another classic Kenyan characteristic to coffee in general. So those factors play off with each other really nicely. I was able to get some nice caramelized aspects to this cup as well. So that's another little benefiting factor to it. But I think for the most part, it's just kind of a little bit more traditional of a Kenyan with a little bit more developed of a profile. I think for the most part, I'll leave this review at that. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee or anything from Fieldwork, we'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it or them as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. And this right here has been a review of the Kainamui wash process Kenya from Fieldwork Coffee. Thank you for watching.